Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives in the world's leading global brands. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Wald, who's an entrepreneur, investor, author, and founder of Work Market, an ADP company. Welcome to the show, Jeff. How are you?
I am doing great, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. I'm unbelievably excited to be here with you today.
Super excited to be joined with you. I think last time we spoke, you were trapped in Malibu with no internet. Not the worst thing in the world.
Not the worst thing in the world. That is true. That is true. That storm that hit the East Coast was powerful and knocked out a lot.
You weren't the only one. Is that week alone, I was speaking to so many HR leaders that are in the same area. And as well, I was like, what a coincidence. And they were like, Chris, can you hear me? I'm on my 4G. I don't know if you can hear me well. I was like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I'll see you again soon, but all back to normal. But where are you today? Same place or?
Today I'm in Manhattan. I'm back in my home office, if you will. That's all we have these days are home offices.
Nice. Well, before we jump in, tell everyone a little bit more about yourself and your journey to where we are today.
I have started a few technology companies. The most recent is a company called Work Market. Work Market is enterprise software that enables corporations to manage their freelance populations. We raised about 100 million in venture capital from some of the leading VCs in the world. And 2.5 years ago, we sold the company to ADP, the world's largest HR company. And it's been just an amazing part of the journey to be a part of ADP and all of their resources. And in that time, I was able to finish a book, which just got released 2 months ago on the future of work, called The End of Jobs, Rise of On-Demand Workers in Agile Corporations. And it's been an amazing journey. We hit #1 in all of Amazon's HR categories, and it's given me the opportunity to have amazing conversations with people like you in formats like this.
Amazing. And what a time to release the book. No one really saw this coming. Has it fast-tracked what you talk about in the book? And if anything, would you have changed anything in the book, given current events?
I may have changed the title. The title, The End of Jobs, when so many people around the world have lost their jobs, is unfortunate. The title was always meant, Chris, to be ironic. The book was never predicting that there was going to be a shortage of jobs, because the book obviously goes into the robots and AI. And there are so many predictions saying, oh my God, robots and AI, they're going to take all the jobs and we're all going to be screwed. And I'm like, no, not at all. Actually, let's look at the data. And so, I wrote the book because I got very frustrated with people making predictions about the future of work that didn't rely on what I call the 3 most important bits of evidence in the world of work. And that is the historic data patterns, the historic context, because history tends to rhyme, and how companies actually engage workers. And so if you're not using data, if you're not using history, if you're not talking to real HR leaders and you're making predictions about the future of work, just stop. You don't know what you're doing and your predictions are crazy. And so the book tries to use those evidence points to make thoughtful, high fidelity predictions about the future of work. But clearly what's going on now is not something anyone would have predicted.
Yeah, everyone's like, the future of work is now. And many of the people talking about the future of work were talking, 20 years from now. But this is certainly fast-tracked it.
100% it is fast-tracked. Not even a question. Remote work is easily the most powerful example of that. Pre-COVID, about 3% of the workforce worked remotely. Post-COVID, it might be upwards of 8%. And people say, oh, that's not enough. I'm like, okay, time out. Slow down. Let's remember that in most economies, only about 40% of workers can work remotely, right? People in retail and transportation and logistics and hospitality and manufacturing can't work remotely. So only about 40% of the economy can work. So when you say 8%, think about it in the context of 40. It's also important to remember when we talk about remote work, you and I understand that means people that are classified as remote workers from an HR standpoint, meaning more than 50% of the time they don't come to the office. So from a tax nexus standpoint, their office is considered their home or some other location. Those has big implications from an infrastructure standpoint and from a tax standpoint. That is not to say that upwards of 30% of the workforce might have a flexible work arrangement where they're not coming to the office as much as they used to. But in terms of people that are fully classified as remote, this pandemic has fundamentally sped up that future of remote work in a way that it would have taken 20, 30 years to get to.
I'm assuming you've had a huge increase in customers at work market given current events? What's the reaction been?
Well, I'll tell you this. I would draw a distinction between on-demand workers and remote workers. Remote workers are not all on-demand, although all on-demand workers are remote workers for the most part. I shouldn't say all. You know, it's interesting when people say, well, why? Why has remote work sped up? And we'll get into on-demand in a second. There were two fundamental things that were impediments to remote work happening at a greater scale. That 3%, we kind of felt, those of us that study the world of work, that maybe it'd grow to 4% over the next 10 years because the low-hanging fruit had been taken. The two things that were a problem were mindsets, very antiquated mindsets where people would say, look, I know what all the studies say, that remote workers are more productive, they're more engaged, they're happier, they cost less, they have lower attrition rates. But I think that productivity happens when people are present. I think magic happens when people are in the office together. And so that mindset was a fundamental impediment. Again, how do companies actually engage workers? They're managers that make those decisions. The second thing were the policies, procedures, and infrastructure necessary. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, we'll have a Zoom meeting, but are you doing a Zoom meeting for all meetings? So therefore, there's always a Zoom option. Therefore, anyone that's remote that day can join in. Most companies, it's such a simple thing. Most companies don't think that way, to have a default Zoom meeting always launch, or a Google or a WebEx or a Microsoft Teams or whatever it is. But more importantly was the infrastructure, the ability to access the company's systems outside of its four walls. And those things were huge impediments, both those mindsets and the infrastructure things, the policies and procedure things had to be changed in March of 2020, come hell or high water, right? It had to be done. And washing those away has unleashed this huge growth in remote work. At some points, in some economies, we were up to about 40% of the workforce working remotely. Its natural limit. Now it is slowly going back as some countries and some jurisdictions are moving back to the office. And that's why I think we'll settle around 8. But that is very different than the on-demand market. And so we can jump to that now if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, before you say that, it's interesting because just before COVID hit, I was speaking with a CHRO, 100,000 plus employees, and she was saying to me, Chris, we've got a 5-year plan to move about 10,000 of our customer service execs remote. 5-year plan. She did it in a week.
Amazing. It is absolutely amazing.
And then she called. We spoke a few months later. She was laughing. She was like, "Chris, putting these systems in places and the policies is actually the easy part, but the mindset shift, which she was describing, is actually the most difficult part, I think, to overcome, because people, the leadership team in her organization, this is not going to work. Because that's all they know. They've always worked that way, so it's super hard to change. Change is hard.
We're going to let people work from home and they're not going to do anything. They're all going to be watching TV. And, we all watched our fair share of TV as we were stuck at home. But for the most part, I think companies are seeing the reality of remote work, which is people can be more productive. They can be more engaged. But I will tell you, Chris, to the point of your friend having to do this in a week, I think the untold story about all this, while we're heralding the amazing effort that everybody did, the secondary impact here is going to be the cyber threat. And as quick as companies put these infrastructure in place to let people work remotely, they could not have done it in a way that dotted every I and crossed every T from a security point. And I think Zoom bombing is going to be the least of people's cybersecurity concerns when the full story of this mass movement and an amazing job that everybody did, I think the cybersecurity story is going to end up being a very large part of this story.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the lessons we can learn from past sort of industrial revolutions that we could kind of adopt in this new current labor market that we're in right now, the students of world of work.
So that was one of the main focuses of the book, right? Our 3 evidence bases: data, history, and how companies engage. History does tend to rhyme. So as we think about this 4th industrial revolution, the robots and AI, what can we learn from the first 3? We can learn a lot. Whether it's the fact that in each of those industrial revolutions, so much power shifted to companies, and workers of the world said, oh my gosh, and prognosticators said, oh my gosh, no one's going to have jobs anymore. Companies don't need workers. They're going to automate everything. Obviously, we know that all those doomsday predictions were wrong. Every time we ended up with ever more workers at an ever higher standard of living, with, importantly, the workers working fewer hours. So the number of hours that were worked is one of the very consistent data trends when you look through the three industrial revolutions, just a very slow and steady decrease in the number of hours worked. People think, oh, the average worker works 2,000 hours. No, the average worker in most OECD countries, most developed countries, work between 1,700 and 1,400 hours per year. And that has been slowly declining over the last 250 years. Those are things that are important to understand. Other things that are important to understand is how workers got a semblance of power back. So I like to think about the framework in the history of work of this power balance between companies and workers. Companies are able to use new technologies and capital allocation and their buying power to massively gain power over workers. And workers have structures, though, to bring balance back to that equation. And those structures are the social safety net, are the regulatory framework, and the union movement. Those are the three things that when you look throughout history have been the counterbalancing forces, allowing workers to, again, get some semblance of power back in that relationship. And so you think about where those things stand right now. In the United States, the union movement is at its lowest in about 100 years in terms of percent of employees that belong to a union. You think about the social safety net in the United States has never been closer to insolvency. Those are things that should give additional pause because the counterbalancing forces, as we are in maybe the second inning of this fourth industrial revolution, it's important to note that it has started. The counterbalancing forces are at very weak points right now. And those are things that should concern workers because to the extent that too much power accumulates to companies, history would tell us it is unsustainable. And so we should be mindful of those things, not only at a company level, but at a societal level. Because when these transitions go poorly, that is a time of revolution. Again, from a history standpoint, we need to be mindful of this. We need to be mindful of the workers being left behind. And we would be wise to put in place the policies from a regulatory standpoint that don't have workers be left behind, that allow for retraining. Because if we don't, the transition is going to be more difficult. Either way, I am very confident that we end up in the same place we've always ended up, with more jobs, with a better standard of living, working fewer hours. But how that transition comes about, if we have very thoughtful public policy, it will happen well. If we don't have very thoughtful public policy, it will happen poorly, but it will happen.
I never thought about it that way. So you did, and I can see it right now. So I was in deep thought thinking about that imbalance, and I'm seeing it. But now you've kind of put it together, and that's a trend. That's what you're saying? That's just something we've been through before many times.
Yes. Yeah. It is a very clear historic pattern of this power balance getting out of whack, going more to companies.
Yeah.
Of things getting pretty hairy. Again, history, revolutions, and things like that.
Yeah.
And then these counterbalancing forces offering some semblance of balance. Yeah. The relationship is never fully in balance. Companies will always have an advantage over workers, but workers can get a semblance of power back in that relationship.
Yeah, and has COVID massively skewed it back in the favor of organizations again? Is that one of the is that hugely?
The short answer is yes. You know, what we see through the history of work, especially in specific geographies and specific skill sets, is that the shortage of a specific skill allows workers to gain the upper hand.
I saw that before COVID. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. I felt like there's a real skill shortage in certain particular areas, and I felt actually for once the employee really had the power.
That is what happens for very discrete periods of time in this economic relationship. You think about things like cybersecurity skills or blockchain or AI skills or things like that. Very hard tech skills are in such tremendous demand, and the education system hasn't produced enough workers yet to provide that. That said, the education system always responds. Supply and demand forces work incredibly well as incentive drivers, and eventually there's a flood of workers with that skill. That is what happens. But it's very important to study those 5 to 10 year periods where the worker gains the upper hand. Very few workers gain the upper hand, but some do. What they tend to do is they tend to then work on demand. They say, yeah, I'll give you my skill set, but as a contractor, I'll come in, do some work for you for 6 months, when I want, how I want, at a price
And then they have the power.
and then I'm going to go work for somebody else, and I'm not coming to your office. I'm going to work from the beach. That is what happens historically, is that workers work as freelancers or contractors when they gain that upper hand because they have the power, so they get to work as they want.
I've got so many friends that are doing similar things now. They're kind of their top of their game in certain professions, and now they're doing the same thing. They're loving it, that lifestyle. Just want to go back for a quick second. What was the inspiration behind the business? Where did Work Market come from? Obviously, you founded and sold a few companies before that. Where did the inspiration of Work Market come from? And you're like, this is where I'm going. This is where I'm going to spend the next sort of 10 years.
I remember a report from McKinsey because, look, when I start a company, you spend almost a year gathering data before you start something. You're reading everything you can. You're talking to everybody you can. And there was a report by McKinsey sometime in 2007, maybe somewhere in that range, that talked about the on-demand labor market and talked about $1 trillion globally in spend. And that the reason that more companies didn't engage on-demand labor is they didn't have the right policies, procedures, and software to engage on-demand labor efficiently and compliantly. And I thought, that's interesting. And McKinsey said, if companies could engage on-demand labor efficiently and compliantly, that $1 trillion would become $3 to $4 trillion. And as you start a company, you obviously want to start something in a market that is huge, in a market that is growing, and you want all the trends in that market to be your friend. You always want the trend to be your friend. You want the market moving towards you. And so to power trillions of dollars in incremental spend seemed like a pretty good idea. And so, myself and my co-founders spent the better part of 2 years kind of thinking about this. I, at the time, had stopped, was in between startups and was back in finance. We spent the better part of 2 years kind of writing this all out, thinking through the ramifications, how we would go to market. And eventually we came up with a plan that had about 20 people that said, as soon as you build it, I will use it. And that is another great thing to have as you're building a company, customers waiting for you.
Of course, especially as a startup. Yeah.
We were super lucky, and we found 2 great investment firms, Union Square Ventures and Spark Capital, that believed so much in the vision, and in my co-founder and I, that they gave us a ton of money with just a PowerPoint deck. It's just me, Jeff, and 19 PowerPoint slides, and they gave us $6 million, and that allowed us to hire a team and start building. And about a year and a half later, we were in market.
Well, we did a summit a few weeks back, and with about 7,000 chief HR officers, one of the topics that coming up was the new global talent market. Because now they're no longer confined to looking at hiring just within their office, right, or their region. They're looking outside the box, right, and looking. But many of them don't know how to start, where to start, what that looks like as well. Is that something? Are you seeing a lot more customers coming to you off the back of this?
So we are seeing a lot of companies say, "Wow, we can start thinking about different pools of labor." And one of the biggest pools of labor that people don't tap is the 25 to 30% of the workforce that works in an on-demand capacity. Yeah. It is a massive part of the labor force. It's been a massive part of the labor force for a very long time. A lot of people conflate on-demand labor and think, oh, this is a new thing. This is a new trend. Full stop, it is not new. But there are a huge amount of workers that this is the only way that you can engage them. And so companies are opening their eyes to that. They're also opening their eyes to a host of different labor pools. I'm not so sure how far afield they'll go. There are a bunch of studies that say most remote workers actually live within a 20-mile radius of the office. They just don't go to the office that often, but companies tend to want them to be relatively close. So I'm not sure that people will use this as an opportunity to go fully global and average costs down with cheaper climates and things like that, or cheaper geographies, but that remains to be seen. But the notion of using more on-demand labor is a very, very powerful trend right now, and it's certainly one we're seeing, but it has a counterbalancing trend. On one hand, companies see this agile workforce, and they saw companies during the beginning of the pandemic that had an on-demand labor force be able to shut their workforce off like that. There was no severance. There was no regulatory, in the United States, it's called the WARN Act. You didn't have to do anything, right? That's the point of on-demand labor. You can turn it on, but you can turn it off. And companies saw that and said, oh my Lord, that's a more agile corporation. It can respond to macro environments, to revenue signals much quicker. And that's good in terms of being able to run an efficient company. But the other side of it is the regulatory environment, specifically here in the United States. California had just passed a law called AB 5, which I'm sure a lot of your US-based HR leaders will know. And I will tell you this, if not for the pandemic, about 10 other states were going to pass a similar law.
What's the law mean? Sorry, because I'm not aware of that. Yeah.
California AB 5 really tightens the definition of a worker and basically assumes everybody is a full-time employee except for a very small slice which can be freelancers or contractors. So 1099s in the US versus W2s. And the laws were specifically designed to go after Uber and Lyft. You may have seen
I see. Okay, I'm with you. Yeah.
Uber and Lyft just lost the challenge to it, and they both said that they were going to shut down their service in California, although last night a judge gave them a reprieve, and so they're not going to shut down their businesses in California. But this is two major companies in the on-demand space saying, we can't do business in California. They were going to stop service in California. Now, if you're a company that does business in California that uses contractors, and you see that two of the largest companies in the world that use contractors say they can't do business in California, it makes you think maybe you can't do business in California. So the point being is that the regulatory environment is a huge headwind. The agile corporation notion is a big tailwind, but we don't know how those two are going to play out against each other. The more that states, and then potentially in a new administration, the federal government, regulate and make it difficult, the more companies back off. The more companies see the advantages of an agile corporation, of new pools of talent, the more they move forward. We don't know how these two are going to play out, but it will be interesting to watch over the next few years.
Just out of curiosity, what advice would you give to the millions of people out there right now that are looking for jobs?
There has never been a tougher time. I mean, look, the biggest hope that we have and the biggest impact on the job market is going to be a vaccine. Just full stop. A vaccine occurs and you will see a massive impact, millions and millions of jobs come back, because there are just certain things that won't happen at scale. People will not be traveling at scale. There will be some people traveling, but it was not going to happen at scale. Hospitality, retail, entertainment, restaurants, like they just don't need as many workers right now. And so those workers have been let go. And that is the vast majority of the impacts to the labor market have been in those jobs. So that aside, so God willing, we get to that point and we're in a post-COVID world. We have more workers working remotely. And then you start thinking about the robots and AI and the displacement of jobs from that. And so when people ask me which jobs are the safest, I always say, go hard. Go hard human or go hard tech. Hard tech jobs growing tremendously even in this period of time.
Yep.
Those are things in AI and cybersecurity and data and software programming. I mean, it's not really debatable at this point. The data is very, very clear on this. These jobs are growing tremendously and will for a very long time, a very, very long time. But what people don't appreciate is the hard human part, that jobs that are around creativity and design and empathy, things clearly computers and AI systems are generations away. Again, generations away from being able to do. Those jobs are also growing very quickly. And those are jobs in HR. Those are jobs in sales and marketing. They're jobs in healthcare and obviously UI design and UX creativity. Like those jobs are also growing and are predicted to grow tremendously. And so those are things to think about, is to go hard one way or the other, because those jobs will have a very bright future. And look, my concern, Chris, when I talk to people about the robots and AI, whether it's educational institutions, whether it's unions and worker groups, there is not going to be huge job losses on a net basis. I would argue, and the book, we obviously spent a long time laying out this argument, I won't do that now, that about 10 to 15% of jobs in the industrialized economy are going to be lost. And those are jobs in data entry, those are jobs in manufacturing and assembly, those are some retail jobs, some transportation jobs. Those jobs are going to be lost, but many more jobs are going to be created in these hard tech and hard human areas. And there'll be jobs created in industries we didn't even know about, because that happens every time. So I would argue that 10 to 15% of jobs are going to be lost, but 10 to 15% of jobs are going to be created and gained. And so there should be no net job losses. But that is not to say that the 25 million workers that will lose their jobs over the next 20 years in the United States are capable of moving into those new jobs.
That's the worry, right? That's the big
That
concern.
is the worry. That to me is the doom of the robots and AI. It's exacerbating the existing gaps in society. It is society doing a poor job of retraining those workers. Because when we talked earlier about a good transition versus a bad transition, if we do not provide the retraining necessary for those workers to get into the job areas that are growing, we do it at our peril, and we will have a bad transition. And that is something, in my opinion, to be avoided at all costs, because that to me is the real scary thing about robots and AI.
I have this debate with my family and friends all the time. I try to explain. You did a much better job than I do, because they're like, no, explain to me then, Chris, how there's not going to be a mass jobs loss when all of these things that can be automated, like you described.
I like to give the example of the ATM, the automated teller machine.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, it's got it in its name. It automated the job of tellers. That's what it did. When the ATM hit its penetration of being in every single bank in the United States, it was about 1995. At the time, there were 500,000 bank tellers employed in the United States. And what do you think people predicted about bank teller employment in the United States?
The ATM is going to replace my job.
Oh my gosh, there are going to be no more bank tellers. We're all screwed. All the bank teller jobs are going to go. Over the next 25 years, we have increased the number of bank tellers in the United States by 20%. 600,000 bank tellers employed in the United States today. People look at that and they say, oh, that's a great example of cobots. This idea that the bank teller job, about 60% of it is this repetitive high volume task of taking in money and giving out money. That task is now done by a machine in the lobby. I don't need a person to do it. I need a person to do it every now and again, because some people have weird things. I did something with my nephew and he earned a couple $100, and I went in and I got it in pennies. I can't do that in an ATM. I needed the teller to give me 80 pounds of pennies to give to him, because that's how I like to mess with my nephew. Aside from those ridiculous requests, you mostly don't need that job. The machine took the mundane, repetitive, high volume task, giving out money, taking in money, and the teller was able to move out from behind the bulletproof glass, had an iPad, and now was able to do customer service. Hi, welcome to ABC Bank. How can I help you? And it gave a better experience to the customer. And it allowed them to cross-sell or upsell. So, let me bring you to one of our investment advisors and we can talk about a mortgage, whatever it was. And so people point to that and they say, oh, look, see, banks engage more tellers. But no, that actually wasn't the answer either. The average number of tellers per branch went from 21 to 13. So banks did engage fewer tellers because a lot of the task was being done by a machine. But here's what happened in the United States in the late 1990s is there was banking deregulation, and the number of bank branches nearly doubled in the United States. And so the point of the anecdote is to say that any simple conclusion that people draw, say, oh, this new technology means all those jobs are going to go, belays the mass complexity that goes into what your listeners know, which is that labor resource discussion that happens at the executive level, potentially at the board level, about the kinds of workers you're going to engage. And it is not as simple as, oh, there's this, therefore we get rid of workers. That's not how companies engage workers. That's not how the conversation goes. In the case of bank tellers, it involved the machine, the ATM itself. It involved other things those tellers could do. It involved the competitive environment. It involved customer service. It involved other technologies like mobile banking that certainly impact the number of tellers. And it involved the regulatory environment, not only on labor engagement, but involved the regulatory environment on bank competitiveness, which was the biggest variable in that equation. And so for people to make simple conclusions just doesn't really apply in our world of labor resource management and how companies make decisions, what history would show us and what the data shows us.
Do you think people are just not willing to do the research?
Oh my God, yeah. Look, Oxford University did an amazing study in 2014 where they analyzed 704 different job categories and what the component tasks were. How many of those tasks were repetitive high volume tasks? and they made the statement that 47% of occupations are susceptible to automation. What do you think the social media driven, soundbite driven world took that as?
Yeah, of course.
47% of jobs are going to go, we're all screwed. People don't want to actually read that study. They don't want to sit there and spend hours and hours reading these things. Luckily, we have people that have very little else to do with their lives, like me, and like to read that stuff and put it into a somewhat digestible format of, a nice, simple to read book.
Yeah. Don't be scared off by the first part of the title of the book, guys.
Do not.
A bit off topic, but actually, really on topic, I suppose. What are your thoughts on education right now? Because we've seen a huge transformation going on, especially with it's been in the news every day in the UK with students just getting their results, and then now most universities are now doing all of their courses online. They already had an online presence, but now it's like all online because they have no choice. So it's going through a huge digital transformation at the moment.
I think that it will I am highly confident that it will end up in a much better place. Like, the education system had been focused on this idea or aspiration that people should go to a 4-year university to get the skills they need to get a high-paying job. Yeah. I don't know that was based on much data. If we look at some data, we can see that 96% of school administrators believe that they are preparing their students for the job market. 94% of hiring managers think people come out of university not prepared for jobs. So huge disconnect on a very high level, where one group thinks one thing and the other group thinks the exact opposite thing. I think the obsession with 4-year universities I think it's already past its peak.
Yeah.
And the idea of 2-year technical colleges or primary or secondary schools, high schools in the United States, doing a lot of more vocational training are starting to really take hold. And as I think about this retraining issue, there are amazing companies out there. There's a company, full disclosure, that I am involved with and an investor in, called Transfer VR, which uses VR technology to do retraining. And they work with some huge manufacturers, global manufacturers, and they work with some states and they work with some universities, and they're seeing 90% reductions in the amount of time and in the cost to getting somebody ready to get onto the line and start working.
They don't have to learn on the line, right? Which is what takes so much time. You can train at home, come in, and be ready to go.
One of the largest defense contractors in the United States was able to train a cohort of people, and again, massively reduced amount of time and amount of money. 98% of them were able to start, and 6 months later, like 94% of them were still there performing well. Like, unheard of results. But the question becomes not those technologies, because companies like Transfer VR are building those technologies and they're blowing up and doing an amazing thing. The question becomes, where do they get fully deployed? Is it the education system, whether it's high schools or 2-year colleges, technical colleges, and things like that, that embrace that training, those hard skills trainings that are necessary, and soft skill trainings, by the way? Is it the individual? Does it become an individual thing where I, as a worker, take it upon myself to do that training? Maybe. Or is it the companies? Do companies feel that workers aren't doing it, that the education system isn't doing it? And are companies being maybe forced by regulation to provide retraining? Whenever you do a mass reduction in workers, maybe you have to engage a company like Transfer VR and give them the skills to go get jobs in areas that are growing. Maybe you either have to do it, or maybe you feel the need to do it because you just need workers to start jobs. That's an ongoing debate, and that, I think, is going to be interesting to see, because it's not just the education system that needs to change. It's the fundamental question of how do workers get the skills that they can then monetize, because the monetization of those skills happens in shorter and shorter periods of time. Meaning, you used to go to university and you'd get a set of skills that could serve you for maybe 30 to 40 years that you could monetize, and then you retired. That model is no longer in existence. The skills that you get, whether it's in university or in coding boot camps or in any other format, now abate in kind of 3 to 5 years, depending on the skill. And so you are constantly going to need to refresh those skills, whether you do it on your own in the education system, whether your company does it for you. That all has yet to play out.
Let's be honest. How many people do you know? I can look at my own friend circle to actually go to university that actually have a job in what they studied.
Not that many.
Like a few. Maybe it's just my friend circle, but not many. I remember getting my first job as or getting my first managerial role, and I was like 18, 19. I didn't go to university. I just went straight into work as a 16-year-old, just straight away. For a few different reasons. One, because I needed to help support my family. And it was strange when I became a manager that my entire 15 sales reps on my team all had a degree, all different things, everything you could possibly think of. And now they're working in these sales roles. And I didn't have a degree, and I was, leading the team. And it kind of took me a while to be like, why is that? And it's kind of what you go back to, if they had some maybe there's some VR sales training sessions while they're doing it, and some hands-on learning, like you're saying, practical skills that would have fast-tracked them to where they are. They didn't need to do a 4-year degree in order to pick up the phone and do some sales.
Completely.
As well. So it's super interesting. And talking about losing jobs in this certain climate, my 80% of our revenue came from events, which obviously disappeared during COVID. And guess what? Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been hiring a lot more talent, a lot more editors. To create content, and I've been hiring all different new skill sets now as we pivot our organization to digital as well. So that's a small example of okay, I'm cutting all of these. We haven't let anyone go, to be honest. We're kind of reskilling everyone, but there are loads of events companies out there that are letting people go. But there's this huge opportunity now to bring in to hire in this other area, or reskill or hire this other talent to focus on digital projects and other areas of opportunity as well. So if you told me, Chris, would you be hiring a few months from now, even just a few weeks ago, I'd be like, no way. But coming out of it now, there's all this new opportunity
I would argue, Chris, that one of the fundamental questions that we'll have as a society is, how do we get people that think about the education system the way you thought about it, which is, I need to go work right now and I want to go earn money when you were 16. Not that everyone needs to do that, but people need to have that mindset of, I need to build up the skills so that I can monetize those skills. Point one, and I think we need to think about as a society, how do we make sure that there are the management incentives for people like you to go and innovate their company and be an agile corporation and go and do those things that are necessary in times like this.
It's interesting because I feel like my learning only began once I stopped going to school. Mm-hmm. As soon as I saw that the learning, this time I'm spending learning, the impact of it in real time, I financially or personal growth and learning, it became something. I was like, oh, I'm actually learning it, and here's the fruits of my labor. Yeah. And I think that's when the obsession came. I always say this on the podcast. Everyone knows it, isn't it? It's like my mantra was like, the more you learn, the more you earn. Yeah. I had that written on the wall in my house. And I live by that. It was literally every day. It's like, the more I learn, the more money I make, the more I can help my family, the more I can give to my mom, my parents, and my brothers and sisters to help us out. And before that, I hated school. Dropped out, obviously, didn't even go college, university, because I just hated the experience. But all of a sudden, this love for learning came because I could see the impact it was having on me, the family, and everyone around me. And hence, obviously, starting this company as well was the biggest learning curve, as you know. So all of a sudden, I'm managing operations, finance, productions, operations, everything else that comes along with it as well. But there's
no better learning environment than a startup. And you love stuff written on walls. We had a lot of stuff written on walls. My favorite was a quote from an intern who we were all having dinner one night very early in the company's history, and people said, oh, I think we should get a ping pong table. I think we should get this. And this intern, who had almost never spoken, she just came in, did her work and whatever. She sat there and she looks up, she goes, it's not fun market, it's called work market. And I thought, that is fantastic. That is up on the wall.
Up on the wall.
Called fun market. It is called work market. We're here to work. That said, we still got a ping pong table and a foosball table because you're a startup and you do that stuff too.
It's so interesting. We're just moving offices as we're actually expanding now. Again, didn't think I'd be doing that. And we were like, oh, do we get a boardroom table that also works as a table tennis table? Like, I don't think we really need that, but maybe we'll get one as well. What I also love, Jeff, is when I came across you and I looked at your LinkedIn profile, you were very proud about showing that you failed in your first business. Why is that something? Because a lot of entrepreneurs that I've met and come across kind of don't talk about that, and actually, if anything, they don't share it at all. They kind of hide that those failures within their career. You're super successful, but why do you make that present to know that failed startup. I think you actually have failed startup, sold 2 startups, failed at 1 on there. Why do you display that with pride?
Look, because I wish I could tell you that I displayed it with pride when it was happening.
Of course not.
Gained the courage to do that after I had 2 successful exits. And so I'm not sure that it's this great lesson in vulnerability, because I'm not vulnerable to it right now. Everyone looks at my failure and says, oh, that's so great. It helped you get the 2 things. So I draw that distinction when people say, oh, you're so vulnerable. I'm like, no, I'm not. That doesn't show vulnerability. I'm not exposing myself to anything. I've already, I've been so fortunate and had all this success. But I think it's important to make sure that people understand that, in startup world, failure is not only an option, it is the most likely outcome. We celebrate all these successes and we put these entrepreneurs on pedestals, and they've accomplished huge amounts of things. The people like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all these other people, it's great. But that is the 0.00001% of people that start companies. And the reality is that a lot of people out there, and they fail. And if they fail, it's okay. We've all been there in some way, whether it's the failure of my first company that nearly bankrupted me, that, had my mom call and asked if I needed to move back home. And I said, all right, in 30 days, if I don't figure something out, yeah, I have to, because I don't have any money anymore. I couldn't pay the rent. And so it's important to know that people go through that, like a lot, and it's okay. You just take your lumps, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you keep going. And don't wallow in it, which is what, a lot of people do. And I did. And it's okay to be upset about it. It's okay to be sad and angry for a little while. And then know others go through this. You have to pick yourself up. You have to dust yourself off and keep going. Because what choice do you have? You can stay down there in the dirt, or you can pick yourself up and keep going. And so I think it's incumbent upon people that have failed, that are comfortable with it, to tell those stories so that more and more people understand the stories are not just the stories of mass success.
Exactly.
Like the stories that most people hear, the experience that most people have is that failure, and that's okay too.
Would you think you'd be where you are now without that failure?
No, I would not. And I'm grateful for the experience. I will be forever grateful for the experience.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting of the outside perspective, right? Because a lot of my friends and family, oh my God, you run your own business, you're an entrepreneur, how amazing! And then on my end, I'm like, sometimes I wish I was employed. It's like it's not all roses, right? Everyone assumes that if you run your own business and you run your own startup, that it's like the best thing ever, and it's like the hardest thing I've ever done, and continue to do as well. So super interesting.
Look, people don't appreciate the 18 hours a day, 7 days a week that it is. Mm-hmm. And so, people are like, oh, you sold your company. That's so amazing. I'm like, yeah, okay. I mean, it is amazing, and I'm super grateful for it. But I hope people understand, I didn't really take a day off for 7.5 years. Yeah. I was in the office every single day, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, if I wasn't on the road. Like, that's what it is to build a company. And it's not glorious or glamorous. It's really, really hard, and it takes a lot of sacrifice. And that's something that people need to understand too, mm-hmm. when you go through that. But it's also been super great to be a part of ADP, because I get to watch as incredibly well-run company, took our platform and really upgraded it from a security standpoint, from a scale standpoint, because I wouldn't pretend that we built everything so perfectly. We built it really well. But getting a chance to watch a company at that scale do things now makes me really understand, as I go down and think about my next company and doing some more innovation, how to really do things a little bit better.
Well, look, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us on the show. I really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, there's sort of one parting piece of advice for everyone, especially when it comes to the on-demand worker space. What would that be? And then where can people connect with you and also grab a copy of the book?
Well, look, my advice to anybody in the professional world is don't give up. That we've all been down in the dust, and you've got to pick yourself up and keep going. And whether that's as a freelancer, and you've seen a lot of clients drop a lot of your work dry up, whether that's to entrepreneurs, whether that's to HR leaders that are trying to move their organizations forward and facing impediments, you've got to just keep pushing. Just do not stop. In terms of connecting, anyone can always reach out on LinkedIn. Or Twitter at Jeffrey Wald, and the book is available for sale everywhere fine books are available. I wish in bookstores, but I don't think bookstores are fully open yet. At least they're not here. But it is certainly available on this little company bookseller called Amazon. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks again for joining us. For everyone listening, I'm going to leave a link in the description to Jeff's LinkedIn profile and a copy of the book, so you can grab it there to make life easier. Apart from that, super excited to see what's next for you, Jeff. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again soon. Okay.
Thank you so much. Take care.
See you later. Bye.